Catherine Delahunty.
Mr. Speaker. This is a bill with some merit, but the Green Party has looked at it closely and, in context and on balance, we remain opposed to some of its key provisions. We may be a lone voice in the House and easily dismissed as unreasonable because there are some good ideas cemented by this legislation, namely the extension of interest-free loans to borrowers from Niue, the Cook Islands, Tokelau and the Ross Dependency. The Green Party is delighted to see the principle of interest-free loans being expanded to these communities and hopes this indicates a recognition by the government that education can be made inaccessible by both geography and market principles, and that the state can positively assist access to tertiary study. But under the new minister, we're not holding our breath, and under the old one, we weren't either. There may not be many students in the Ross Dependency, however, at the moment, but who knows? If we stick to the current pathetic climate targets, the area may become warm enough for a whole university in the lifetimes of our children. The Green Party also applauds the modifications that have been made to the bill since the Select Committee process, which has resulted in the Inland Revenue Department accepting, with a little bit of pressure, that they had made a mistake in not notifying some students about overdue loan repayments and therefore could not penalise them. There was a proposal to enforce a 15% repayment rate on these students, but fortunately after some discussion at Select Committee, which I was happy to persist with, the Inland Revenue withdrew support for this idea. This is a good example of the value of Select Committees in highlighting anomalous provisions that would create unintended consequences and unfairness, and the change is well made. However, we remain concerned about this bill, but mainly because of the late payment penalties. As the New Zealand Students' Association stated in their submission, the increases proposed through this compulsory repayment deduction would be unmanageable and unacceptable. Student loan repayments kick in at the very low threshold of $19,084, and now is one of the worst possible times to increase student repayment rates. Whatever the optimistic economists and politicians choose to say, we are in recession, and many students are part of the low-paid and underpaid, struggling to meet rent and food and clothing costs, let alone debt. This applies especially to women students and former students who are yet to experience pay equity in many occupations, let alone in the public sector. It is all so easy for Campbell Live to focus on the minority of irresponsible young people who wasted their money on inappropriate goods and behaviours. They, however, are not the people necessarily who will be hurt by the increase in late repayment. And even they are merely reflecting back to us the lessons we have taught them. You can have it all. You can borrow and spend. And you can live with debt because you're worth no real investment and you must bear the risks. The relationship with debt, which the student loan scheme entrenches, is one of the most insidious and destructive processes invented. In a world where shopping for the latest goods and experiences that global capitalism can provide is promoted to everyone on every screen, you cannot blame the young for wanting it. Then we lend them money for their education. First there was the crippling interest on all those loans and on all students. And then there was the interest on overseas students only. And now there are murmurings of more changes to the student loan scheme by the new Tertiary Minister, Stephen Joyce. Now, it's pretty clear that Mr Joyce was not given this portfolio just to eat his lunch in between building more unnecessary motorways, and that the student loan scheme could always be made worse for students. And this was also signalled in the Prime Minister's address to this House when he waxed lyrical and said, quote, "A careful look at student loans and allowances to ensure the taxpayers' generosity is not being exploited." What did he mean? He's really concerned about the public getting their money's worth, but students are the public and they are not getting their money's worth. And now we have Stephen Joyce rolling up his sleeves to see what can be done about it. The political risk of reintroducing interest on loans seems too high right now, but as Stephen Joyce said last weekend, quote, "We are going to look at other requirements around these student loans." Now, what does Mr Key mean by taxpayer generosity? Does he mean all of us older politicians who had no student loans are being awfully kind by indebting the next generation, and we will demand more blood? What does Joyce mean? Mr. Joyce mean? Could he be referring to eligibility to enter study or to remain there? Will that be tightened? None of this is good news for students. But in the meantime, this bill does cause concern for the Green Party, mainly because of Part 1, Section 22A, which allows for an increase in the standard deduction rate of 10 cents in the dollar to a maximum rate of 15 cents in each dollar. Part 2, Clause 55, does talk about hardship relief. Considering that many students are in hardship, they might need to think about this provision because it could apply to a lot of people they're about to impose extra penalties on. But if the IRD Commissioner considers a repayment obligation would cause serious hardship, he or she can offer hardship relief. But since serious hardship is not defined and will have to be proven, very many people are unlikely to be able to gain this form of protection from Clause 20. So we are very concerned about adding debt to people who are already failing to repay. It doesn't incentivise, it punishes. This is a bit like environmental pollution, whereby the burden of proof is always on the citizen, not the polluter. The burden of hardship is on the student to prove they're in hardship, who has no choice but to have a debt if they want to study. And if they are not wealthy, they cannot always earn their way out of it. On the Select Committee, there was much talk about how you can earn your way out of this. And so many people I know who have left university are not earning their way out of it because they are barely managing to live, let alone get a mortgage, and their student loan is still a huge burden on them. They are not progressing financially in the way that my generation just took for granted. And it's purely unfair. It's a real indication of the value we put on our student body and the value we put on our society as a whole, because the poor cannot earn their way out of it when they are starting off with a debt as young people, something that I did not experience. So we oppose the burden, the additional burden, and the burden of proof being on students to prove that they are in hardship. We are opposed to the provisions of the bill to an extent that we have to vote against it. And although we do think at the Select Committee there was good discussion about all the different aspects of the extension of interest-free loans, and we support that, we are deeply in opposition to adding to the hardship in Section 20. It's just not fair to use the student loan scheme as a way of keeping people in poverty. And to say that it's a debt on the country is true, but we have to take responsibility for the debt that was created. We created that debt when we created the student loan scheme. Many people out there today know what I'm talking about because they have not earned enough. Women, migrants and refugees, tangata whenua, Pacifica, people with disabilities have absolutely no chance of the high wage economy that the student loan scheme assumes is behind people's ability to repay loans. So the Green Party will continue to be consistent and principled in our attitude towards the student loan scheme and to added burdens on young people in their education and future life. And we will not support this bill. Kia ora.